No one in Thornwood remembered a sacred moon festival as grand as the one held that year. The silver torches had been lit before sunset, their flames trembling in the evening wind like spirits called down from ancient bloodlines. The ceremonial stones had been washed with spring water. White petals were scattered across the central ring. Every elder wore formal markings. Every warrior stood straighter than usual. Every unmated wolf in the pack understood that tonight wasn't simply a celebration. It was a declaration of order, destiny, and power. And in the center of that order stood Alfredo Foresight. He looked exactly the way a pack expected its alpha to look. Proud shoulders, sharp jaw, controlled expression, the kind of face that made others lower their voices when he entered a room. Beside him should have stood the woman meant to complete the sacred image of Thornwood's future. The Luna, the chosen one, the fated mate whose bond would strengthen the Alpha's line and stabilize the pack for generations. That woman was Connie. Or rather, that woman should have been Connie. She stood at the edge of the ceremonial circle in a pale dress stitched by the healer women 3 nights earlier. Her hands were cold. Not trembling exactly, though everyone watching would have assumed she was nervous. The truth was stranger than fear. Since sunrise, she had felt the mate bond moving under her skin like an invisible current, pulling at her chest, her throat, the base of her spine. It wasn't pain. Not yet. It was recognition. It was that unbearable sense of inevitability, as if some old law written before language itself had reached down and placed a mark upon her. She could feel Alfredo, too. Not emotionally. Not in the soft, romantic way the old stories described. She felt him the way one feels approaching thunder. A powerful force. A presence that changed the air. He was her fated mate. That much was true. But standing there that night, Connie already sensed something none of the elders could read on her face. Fate did not always arrive with kindness. When Elder Miriam raised her staff and called for silence, the whole of Thornwood obeyed. The younger wolves straightened. The children stopped whispering. The drummers fell quiet. The moon lifted above the pines, full and white, as if the sky itself had come to witness the binding. Tonight, Elder Miriam said, the blood of Thornwood honors the sacred laws. Our Alpha stands before the moon. His destined mate stands before the moon. Let the bond be acknowledged, so that strength may multiply, and our future may be secured. Connie took one step forward. A few faces in the crowd softened. Some smiled. Others watched with cooler eyes. Connie knew those eyes well. Thornwood had never hated her openly. That would have been easier. Instead, many of them had always measured her and quietly found her lacking. She was not weak, not truly, but she had never been spectacular in the ways this pack admired. She wasn't born into an influential branch family. She wasn't politically sharpened. She wasn't famous for beauty that silenced rooms. She wasn't fierce in the loud, theatrical way some future Lunas were expected to be. She healed herbs better than she fought. She listened more than she boasted. She noticed people others overlooked. In another place, those might have been strengths. In Thornwood, they looked too much like softness. Alfredo stepped into the moonlight opposite her. The sacred runes painted across his collarbone flashed silver. For one suspended second, Connie believed that if he simply looked at her as a person instead of an obligation, everything would change. The bond between them tightened. The whole clearing seemed to inhale. Then Alfredo spoke. I reject the bond. No one moved. The words were simple, clean, controlled, but they landed with the violence of a blade driven into ritual itself. The moonlight did not dim, and yet the entire ceremony seemed to lose color. Even the air changed. Connie felt the first sharp fracture tear through her chest, not visible to anyone else but so violent her knees almost weakened. Elder Miriam stared at him in disbelief. Alpha Alfredo, she said, voice low and warning. Do you understand what you are invoking? I do, he replied. His eyes flicked to Connie then, but only briefly, as though looking too long at her might imply uncertainty. I will not bind Thornwood to a Luna who cannot stand at the level this pack requires. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Connie heard every word after that with a terrible clarity. Not because she wanted to, because humiliation sharpens memory like ice sharpens glass. She lacks presence, Alfredo said. She lacks command. Thornwood does not need a gentle heart at its center. It needs a symbol of strength, a Luna who inspires obedience, a Luna worthy of standing beside her Alpha. Connie didn't speak. Her throat wouldn't let her. The worst part wasn't the rejection itself. It was the ease in his voice. He did not sound cruel. He sounded convinced, calm, strategic, like a leader explaining a necessary decision for the greater good. That was what made it devastating. He wasn't rejecting her in a moment of rage. He was dismissing her as an unsuitable component in his model of power. To Alfredo, Connie was not a woman whose heart he was breaking. She was a flaw in the image he meant to build. Someone in the crowd laughed under their breath and quickly stopped. Others looked embarrassed. A few looked relieved. Elder Miriam tried once more to intervene, but the old law was clear. An alpha could reject a fated mate publicly under moon witness, though everyone knew the consequences were dangerous, especially when the bond was already partially awakened. It was a law rarely used because it was considered both spiritually reckless and politically explosive. Alfredo used it anyway. Connie finally forced herself to stand straighter. She would remember that later. Not the petals at her feet, not the cold in her hands, not even the tearing agony behind her ribs. She would remember that she stood straight when half the clearing expected her to collapse. "Do you have anything to say?" Elder Miriam asked her gently. Yes, Connie thought. 1,000 things. She wanted to ask Alfredo when exactly he had decided she was unworthy. Was it when she chose to treat injured Omega children instead of sitting with the daughters of ranking families? Was it when she failed to smile sweetly enough at council dinners? Was it when he realized she did not worship him the way others did? Or had he simply looked at her one day and seen a woman who could not be molded into a decorative extension of his rule? But humiliation has a strange way of turning fire into silence. So Connie lifted her head, met Alfredo's eyes, and said the only thing dignity would allow. "I understand." It was not forgiveness. It was not surrender. It was simply the last unbroken piece of herself speaking before the pain caught up. Because the pain did come. Not all at once. That would have been merciful. It began as a hot pressure under her skin and spread in widening rings through her ribs, shoulders, spine. The bond had been summoned, recognized, and cut before completion. Her inner wolf, still forming the sacred connection, reacted as if a living nerve had been severed. Connie did not scream, but she felt the world tilt. And for one terrifying second, all the torchlight blurred. No one ran to her. That, more than anything, told her the truth about Thornwood. Some looked sorry. Some looked uncomfortable. But the pack followed Alfredo's lead in everything that mattered. If the Alpha had declared Connie unworthy, then standing beside her too openly could look like opposition. And Thornwood had become the kind of place where people measured compassion against political risk. Brianna Sadlio, Alfredo's ambitious cousin, stepped closer to his side before the ceremony had even fully dissolved. She didn't smile, but Connie saw calculation in the angle of her chin. Around them, the whispers had already changed shape. Not grief, not shock. Adjustment. Reorganization. Thornwood was moving on in real time, absorbing Connie's erasure before the petals even settled. Connie turned and walked out of the moon circle alone. No one stopped her. The farther she moved from the central clearing, the harder it became to breathe. By the time she reached the tree line, the pain in her chest had sharpened into something almost predatory, as if the bond itself was trying to reattach to a place that no longer wanted it. She gripped a pine trunk to steady herself. Beneath her skin, her wolf recoiled, confused and wounded. A voice came from behind her. "Connie." It was Mara, one of the older herbalists. Kind-eyed, hesitant, too frightened of being seen as disloyal to help publicly, but brave enough to follow now. Connie didn't turn. "Please don't tell me this happened for a reason." Mara stopped a few feet away. "I wasn't going to." "Good." The older woman hesitated. "You should let me check your pulse." Connie gave a bitter laugh that sounded like it belonged to someone else. "Will that make him take the words back?" "No." "Will it make the pack forget what they saw?" "No." "Then not tonight." Mara came no closer. After a silence, she said, "What he did was dangerous." Connie closed her eyes. "I know. He wounded more than your pride." That was true. Over the next days, Connie would learn just how true. But even in that first shattered hour, she could already feel the damage. Something essential inside her had been disrupted. The rhythm of her body no longer felt whole. Her wolf, once a faint but steady inner presence, seemed to retreat deeper into silence with each passing minute. Still, the physical pain wasn't the deepest wound. The deepest wound was revelation. Connie had spent years believing Thornwood was harsh but honorable, proud but protective. That night showed her something uglier. Pack culture there was not built around strength alone. It was built around appearance, hierarchy, and obedience to the Alpha's image of worth. Alfredo had not simply rejected her because of personal preference. He had done it because he saw leadership as performance. And Connie did not fit the role he wanted displayed beside him. A real Luna, in his mind, was not someone who could heal a divided people. A real Luna was someone who made his rule look stronger. Once Connie understood that, something cold and precise settled under the pain. This wasn't just heartbreak. It was political exile dressed up as fate. The days that followed stripped away whatever illusions the festival had left behind. Thornwood became unbearably polite. That was worse than cruelty. Warriors who once greeted Connie with warmth now nodded too quickly and moved on. Younger wolves stopped seeking her advice openly. Invitations disappeared. Conversations quieted when she entered a room. The healer hall, once her refuge, became a space where even sympathy arrived in whispers. No one wanted to be seen choosing her side, because in Thornwood, there was no side except the Alpha's. Alfredo never apologized. He also never harassed her, which almost made it more insulting. He behaved as if the matter were settled, dignified, regrettable perhaps, but necessary. In council, he spoke of patrol routes, supply treaties, and future strengthening of alliances. He moved through pack life with the composure of a man convinced he had done what leadership required. That composure began to poison Connie's mind. Had he been right? The question slipped in at night when the bond pain got worst. It came when her hands shook, reaching for dried herbs. It came when her wolf failed to rise during training and she had to pretend exhaustion rather than weakness. It came when she caught her own reflection and saw not an insulted future Luna, but a woman people had so easily agreed to leave behind. Maybe she was too soft, too quiet, too ordinary. Maybe Thornwood had only spoken aloud what the world already knew. That was the real violence of Alfredo's rejection. It didn't merely injure Connie's body. It colonized her self-perception. It used the authority of the Alpha, the ritual authority of the moon, and the social authority of the pack to turn one man's judgment into something that felt like objective truth. And environments like Thornwood were good at that. They taught people to mistake hierarchy for wisdom, to believe that if a powerful voice names you lacking, the lack must be real. Connie might have drowned in that thinking if her body had not begun to fail. By the second week after the festival, she was barely sleeping. The severed bond sent waves of fever and weakness through her at unpredictable intervals. Her appetite faded. Worse, her wolf, once a quiet silver awareness in the back of her mind, seemed dimmer each day. Transformation became difficult. Even partial shifts left her shaking. The elder healers exchanged worried looks whenever they thought she wasn't watching. The bond was interrupted too violently, Mara told her in private. Your inner energy is draining instead of settling. Can it be repaired? Mara was silent for too long. Can it? Connie asked again. Not here, Mara said softly. That answer lingered. Not here. Thornwood suddenly looked different after that. Not just hostile, suffocating. Everywhere Connie went, she passed spaces shaped by Alfredo's worldview. The training ring where aggression was praised louder than discipline. The council hall where obedience carried more weight than truth. The women's quarters where whispers still circled around who might better suit the Alpha's side. Even the forest trails felt narrower, as though the land itself had bent around a pack that no longer had room for her spirit. Then, one evening, Connie overheard two warriors near the armory. Maybe it's for the best, one said. Can you imagine her at his side during winter negotiations? She never had the Alpha's edge, the other replied. Their voices weren't malicious. Casual, almost. That hurt more. Connie walked away before they saw her. By the time she reached the eastern ridge overlooking Thornwood, the sun had already sunk behind the pines. She stood there a long time, staring at the roofs below, the smoke rising from the main hall, the sentries changing posts. It had been her home. She had defended it in her heart even when it misunderstood her. But from that ridge, with the cold wind cutting through her cloak and the ruined mate bond burning faintly under her ribs, Connie finally admitted something she had resisted since the festival. If she stayed, Thornwood would not merely grieve her, it would unmake her. Not all at once, quietly, politely, completely. A place does not need to strike you to destroy you. Sometimes it only needs to convince you that your smallness is natural, and that was what Thornwood had become. Behind her, a twig snapped. Connie turned, expecting a patrol wolf. It was Elder Miriam. The old woman approached slowly, moonlight silvering the edges of her gray braid. She did not waste time with false comfort. "You are leaving," the elder said. Connie should have been startled, but wasn't. "I haven't told anyone." "You didn't have to." Connie looked back toward the pack below. "Will anyone try to stop me?" Elder Miriam's eyes rested on Thornwood for a long moment. "No." The honesty of that answer cut deep, but it was also strangely freeing. "Then I suppose that tells me everything." "It tells you enough." Connie swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "You knew this place was changing." "Yes." "You knew what Alfredo was becoming." "Yes." "Why didn't you stop him?" A harder question. Elder Miriam accepted it without anger. Because old laws can guide a people, but they cannot save a pack determined to mistake control for strength. Alfredo listens only to what reinforces his instincts. He has many gifts. Humility is not among them. Connie gave a low, bitter laugh. "That seems like a dangerous quality in an alpha." "It is." The wind moved between them. Finally, Elder Miriam stepped closer and pressed a small leather packet into Connie's hand. Dried moonroot, fever bark, silverleaf, healing herbs, travel herbs. "There are old roots through the eastern mountains," the elder said. "Beyond them lies Shadow Vale territory." Connie looked up sharply. "You're sending me to another pack?" "I am sending you somewhere this wound may not consume you." "Why would they help me?" "Because not every alpha leads the way Alfredo does." Connie almost said, "I don't believe that anymore." But some weak, stubborn part of her still wanted to. "Will Shadow Vale welcome a broken wolf from Thornwood?" she asked. Elder Miriam's voice grew very quiet. "That depends on whether you arrive believing you are broken." The words settled into Connie's chest beside the pain. Not healing. Not comfort. Something smaller, but still alive. A choice. She looked once more at Thornwood below. Her first home. Her first loyalty. The place where she had learned herbs, seasons, and the names of every winter constellation. The place that had also watched her stand under the moon and be judged unworthy. Maybe both truths could exist at once. Maybe loving a place did not obligate her to die inside it. "I'll leave before dawn," Connie said. Elder Miriam nodded. "Go east. Keep to the ridgeline for 2 days. Avoid river crossings after dark." And Connie waited. "When you tell this story to yourself later, do not say that an alpha rejected you because you were too small for the role. Say that a failing leader could not recognize the form strength had taken when it stood in front of him." Connie felt something dangerous rise behind her eyes. She looked away before it could become tears. That night she packed lightly. A travel cloak, herbs, water skin, dried meat, a small silver knife, her mother's moon pendant. She moved through her room without ceremony. There was nothing to memorialize. Thornwood had already begun erasing her. Near dawn, as the horizon turned pale, Connie stepped past the last boundary marker and did not look back again. She did not know then that Alfredo's rejection would become the first crack in Thornwood's future. She did not know that Shadow Vale would show her an entirely different meaning of power. She did not know that the wolf inside her, now dim and hurting, carried something older and rarer than any of them suspected. All she knew was this: She had not been rejected only as a mate. She had been denied a place inside a system that could not imagine strength unless it arrived wearing the right face. And somewhere beyond the eastern mountains, whether in pain or in hope, Connie was about to learn that some exiles are not endings. Some are the first honest road toward becoming impossible to dismiss. The eastern mountains looked different when seen not as a distant border, but as a passage one had no choice except to cross. From Thornwood, they had always seemed like a jagged wall of blue-gray stone at the edge of maps, a place mentioned in hunting reports and territorial discussions, never in personal terms. But to Connie, moving toward them on aching legs with a half-damaged wolf and a chest that still throbbed with the aftershocks of rejection, they did not look like geography. They looked like consequence. The first day was easier than the second. Pain still allows movement when pride is doing part of the work. Connie walked because returning was impossible. She kept to the ridgeline just as Elder Miriam instructed, following deer trails where she could and old wolf paths where she had to. The cold air stung her lungs. Each breath seemed to scrape the inside of her ribs. By noon, her cloak was damp with sweat despite the wind, and more than once she had to stop when the severed bond flashed through her body like heat poured directly into bone. But she kept moving. There is a kind of stubbornness that only appears after humiliation, when a person realizes the old version of home will not open its doors again. Connie had no grand speech in her head, no vow of vengeance, no polished declaration of reinvention. She simply understood that if she stopped, the silence inside her would grow heavier, and if she turned back, Thornwood would finish teaching her to doubt her own worth. So she walked east. By the second day, the landscape began to strip her thoughts down to essentials. Hunger, thirst, shelter. The practical needs were almost a relief. They kept her from replaying the Sacred Moon Festival moment by moment. The memory still rose. Of course, Alfredo's even voice. The crowd's shifting silence. The words unworthy. Lacks command. Lacks presence, but the mountains were unforgiving to people who traveled while emotionally distracted. A loose stone could split an ankle. A sudden storm could erase a trail. Night could turn beautiful scenery into something that waited with teeth. That reality steadied her. Toward dusk on the second evening, Connie tried to shift partially to gain speed over broken ground and nearly collapsed. Her wolf responded slowly, painfully, as if reaching through mud. Silver flickered under her skin, then vanished. The effort left her shaking so violently she had to sit on a flat stone and clamp both hands around her forearms to stop it. Panic rose hard and fast after that. What if Mara had been wrong? What if the damage could not be healed anywhere? What if the bond Alfredo cut had taken more than her future as Luna? What if it had taken the core of her wolf entirely? Connie bent forward and forced herself to count breaths. The sky was turning indigo over the peaks. She needed a place to make camp. Fear would have to wait until morning, like so many other things. She found a narrow overhang halfway up a granite slope and built a small, sheltered fire from scrub pine and dead branchwood. The fever came after full dark, not the dramatic kind that burns hot enough to make a body delirious, but the quieter kind that slides under the skin and leaves the mind too sharp. Connie lay wrapped in her cloak, listening to the wind whistle through stone cracks and thinking of all the stories told in Thornwood about wolves who left their pack. The stories always made leaving sound like betrayal, or weakness, or madness, as if any wolf who crossed a border must already have lost their nature. Lying there in pain, Connie began to understand the hidden purpose of those stories. They were warnings designed to keep people where power could still name them. If you teach someone that leaving means failure, they will tolerate far more than they should before walking away. Near midnight, she dreamed of the mate bond, but not as memory. In the dream, it looked like a thread of silver stretched over black water, snapped in the middle yet still humming at both broken ends. One end vanished into darkness where Thornwood stood. The other led deeper into mountain fog. When Connie reached toward it, a second glow appeared beneath the water, brighter and colder than the first. Like moonlight striking polished metal, she woke before she could see what it was. Morning brought sleet. The third day nearly broke her. The mountain path narrowed into a ledge barely wider than her boots, and twice she had to flatten herself against wet stone while wind tore at her cloak. By afternoon, her supplies felt heavier than they were, her heartbeat too loud in her ears. At one point she stumbled, descending a shale slope and sliced her palm on rock. Blood welled bright against gray dust. She stared at it longer than necessary. There had been a time, not long ago, when that amount of blood would have summoned her wolf instantly, sharpening her senses, drawing up her strength. Now all she felt was dull exhaustion and a delayed pulse of pain from the damaged bond. Her body no longer trusted itself. Something in that realization hollowed her out. She did not cry often. Thornwood had trained reserve into its daughters long before Alfredo ever spoke his rejection aloud. But standing alone on that shale path, wind needling her face, Connie felt grief arrive in a more dangerous form than tears. Not loud, not even visible. It came as surrender. Maybe Elder Miriam was wrong. Maybe this journey wasn't brave. Maybe it was only slower dying. Maybe Shadowvale would look at her the way Thornwood had and see a discarded thing approaching their border, useful only as gossip or burden. Maybe Alfredo had not destroyed her, but perhaps he had been first to name what the rest of the world would eventually confirm. Connie closed her wounded hand and waited for the despair to finish speaking. Then another voice rose, quieter but harder. If that were true, Thornwood would not have needed to convince you. She stood still after that, wind pushing, blood drying on her palm, mountains silent all around. And she understood something she had not been able to see while living inside the pack that rejected her. A toxic hierarchy is never satisfied with hurting you once. It must also train you to continue the work after it is done. It must teach you to repeat the verdict privately so no one has to control you publicly. Connie exhaled slowly, wrapped her hand, kept walking. By the time she crossed the final eastern ridge near sunset, she looked nothing like a future Luna. Her hair had come loose from its braid. Her boots were caked in mud and shale. Her cheeks were wind-burned. She had not eaten enough, slept enough, or shifted properly in days. But when she reached the overlook and saw the valley below, she forgot her exhaustion for one suspended instant. Shadowvale was not what she expected. Thornwood, for all its claims of strength, had been organized around display. Central halls, elevated council architecture, training yards placed where everyone could witness skill and rank. Shadowvale, by contrast, looked almost grown from the land instead of imposed upon it. Stone lodges curved into the slopes. Timber walkways linked terraces built around existing trees rather than clearing them. Smoke rose from low hearth chimneys. On the western end of the valley, Connie could see a ringed training field, but it was not elevated like a stage. Below it, near a wide stream, were herb gardens laid in careful patterns, larger than any in Thornwood. Even from a distance, the place did not feel weak. It felt rooted. That unsettled her more than hostility would have. Connie made it halfway down the valley path before 3 wolves appeared from the tree line. Border patrol. Efficient. Silent. They had already scented her long before she saw them. The lead wolf shifted first. Tall, broad-shouldered, late 30s perhaps, with dark skin and a scar crossing one eyebrow. He wore no ceremonial rank markers, only travel leathers and a short blade at his side. The other 2 remained half-shifted, watchful but not openly aggressive. "You crossed into Shadowvale territory an hour ago," the man said. Connie straightened, despite the urge to lean on the nearest tree. "I know." "Name." "Connie." "Pack." She hesitated. The man noticed. "We can smell Thornwood." "I'm not here on Thornwood's behalf." "No," he said, eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't smell like someone sent with pride." That stung because it was true. "I need to speak with your alpha," Connie said. One of the other patrol wolves gave a short, humorless laugh. The lead man silenced him with a glance. Everyone who crosses a border in trouble thinks they need to speak to an alpha. Connie's knees felt dangerously light. "Then consider me unoriginal." That earned the smallest shift in his expression. Not warmth. Interest. "You're injured." "Yes." "Chased?" "No." "Lying?" Connie would have laughed if she had any strength left. "Too tired." He studied her for another moment. Not the way Thornwood males often studied women, measuring performance, appearance, usefulness. His gaze moved like assessment of risk and fact. Controlled, professional, Finally, he said, "I'm Ernesto Evans." Connie blinked. Not because the name meant anything yet, but because his tone did. There had been no introduction in it, no performance, just information. And then a second realization hit her almost immediately after the first. Ernesto Evans was the Alpha. Of course he was. Not because he stood like Alfredo, he didn't. Alfredo was all polished command and cultivated presence. Ernesto's authority sat differently, more like gravity than lightning, more like something the valley itself had accepted. Connie nearly swayed before catching herself. "I didn't realize. Most strangers don't." His eyes dropped briefly to the blood seeping through the bandage on her palm, then rose again. "Why do you want to speak to me?" "Because I was thrown out of the story I thought my life was heading toward. Because my body is failing. Because my pack taught me that my value depended on how well I fit an Alpha's vision of power. And I need to know whether there is any place in this world where strength means something else." Instead, she said, "Because I don't think I survive if I go back." The air shifted after that. Not dramatically. No one gasped. No warrior stepped forward in outrage or pity. But Connie saw a subtle change pass through Ernesto's patrol. A listening, a recognition that this was not simple border trespass. Ernesto held her gaze for a long beat. Then he asked, "Who did this?" The question almost undid her, not because of what it asked, but because of what it assumed. He had not asked what mistake she made. He had not asked why Thornwood cast her out. He had not asked what she did to deserve this. He had looked at her failing body and understood damage before blame. "My Alpha," Connie said at last, "at the Sacred Moon Festival." He rejected a fated mate bond publicly after it had already awakened. One of the patrol wolves cursed softly under his breath. Ernesto's expression did not change, but the stillness around him sharpened. "That is not leadership," he said. "That is vanity, using old law as cover." Connie stared at him. No one in Thornwood had spoken of Alfredo that way. Not even Elder Miriam. They had called it dangerous, unfortunate, spiritually reckless, but not what it truly was. Vanity using old law as cover. It was like hearing her pain translated into a language that made sense. And because her defenses were already worn thin by hunger, cold, and exhaustion, that simple act of being understood nearly broke the last of her composure. "I crossed the mountains," she said, voice unsteady now despite herself. "I was told there might be healers here who could prevent the bond damage from getting worse. I'm not asking for rank, or protection I haven't earned. Just," her breath caught, "just a chance not to disappear because one man decided I was not useful to the picture he wanted beside him." Silence again. Then Ernesto stepped closer. Close enough to catch her if she collapsed, but not so close it felt like pressure. He was taller than Alfredo, but not harder. Or maybe hardness was the wrong measure. Alfredo's presence had always demanded that people orient around it. Ernesto's presence did something stranger. It made space without surrendering strength. "You crossed 3 days of mountain terrain in that condition?" he asked. Connie nodded once. "Alone?" "Yes." One corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile. "Then courage isn't the thing you're lacking." That sentence entered her more deeply than any medicine could have in that moment, not because it healed her. It didn't. The pain was still there. Her body still shook with weakness. Her future was still uncertain. But those words contradicted Thornwood's verdict with a clean directness that felt almost holy. Courage isn't the thing you're lacking. Not beauty. Not grace. Not rank. Not compatibility with power. Courage. Ernesto turned to one of the patrol wolves. "Take her to the South Infirmary. Send for Gina West and the Valley Healers. Tell Jason Phillips I want full discretion on any political implications. No word leaves this patrol line until I hear the details myself." The others moved at once. Connie stared. "You don't even know me." "No," Ernesto said. "But I know what it costs a wolf to cross mountains alone while half-bond wounded. People don't do that for attention. They do it because staying would kill something essential." He extended a hand, not as Alpha to supplicant, but as one steady human offering another a bridge over the next few steps. Connie looked at it for the briefest moment before taking it. His grip was firm, warm, grounding. No possessiveness, no drama, just help. And because the body understands safety before the mind fully trusts it, something inside Connie, something cramped and starving and braced for rejection, eased by one impossible inch. Shadowvale did not welcome her with celebration. That mattered. If they had rushed to flatter or exalt her, she might have mistrusted it. Instead, they received her with function. The South Infirmary smelled of cedar smoke, silverleaf, and clean linen. Healers worked efficiently. Questions were asked without accusation. Her fever was checked, pulse monitored, bond flare patterns mapped. Gina West arrived before full dark, a severe-looking woman with braided black hair, scarred forearms, and the alert posture of someone who missed nothing. "She crossed the mountains like this?" Gina asked after the first examination. Ernesto, still present though not hovering, said, "She did." Gina looked at Connie with open appraisal. "That's either stupidity or grit. Undecided." Connie murmured. To her surprise, Gina snorted. "Good. You still have enough spine to be sarcastic." The healers gave Connie a bitter tincture that dulled the bonfire without numbing her senses completely. When she drifted half awake on the cot later, she heard voices in the adjoining room. Ernesto. Gina. Another man measured. Analytical. Likely Jason Phillips. "Thornwood will deny liability," Jason was saying. "I don't care what language they use," Gina replied. "The damage pattern is obvious. And politically?" Ernesto's voice came low and steady. "Politically, Shadowvale does not return wounded travelers to the place that broke them. There was no theatrical oath in it. Just principle." Connie turned her face toward the wall and cried silently for the first time since the festival, not from weakness, but from the unbearable disorientation of entering a place where authority did not immediately translate into dismissal. Over the next days, Shadowvale continued to unsettle her by being different in ways she could not yet name. No one asked whether Alfredo had been right about her unsuitability as Luna. No one implied she should be grateful merely to have survived. No one treated her as contamination. She was watched, yes, carefully, reasonably. She was a Thornwood wolf with political implications stitched into her very pulse. But she was watched the way a community watches a wounded person entering fragile stability, not the way a court watches a scandal. Ernesto visited only twice during those first days, and both times briefly. Again, that mattered. A lesser alpha might have turned her situation into spectacle or leverage. Ernesto did neither. When he came, he asked precise questions. How severe was the fever? Had the inner wolf responded during treatment? Was the bond pain constant or wave-based? Did she want Shadowvale to send formal notice to Thornwood, or keep her presence private for now? No assumptions. No pressure. The second time he came, Connie asked him directly, "Why are you helping me?" Ernesto seemed mildly surprised by the question. "Because help is needed." "That simple?" "Yes." She almost laughed. "That sounds suspiciously unlike politics." "It isn't unlike politics," he said. "It's just politics not built on cruelty." That stayed with her long after he left, because Connie was beginning to see that Shadowvale's true difference was not kindness alone. Kindness without structure can vanish the moment fear arrives. What she sensed here was something more durable, a culture where care had been built into systems. Healers had standing. Trainers spoke with medics. Advisors considered long-term social impact alongside territorial security. Authority still existed, clearly, but it didn't seem obsessed with humiliating vulnerability. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, Connie slept without dreaming of the moon circle. Leaving Thornwood, she slowly realized, had not been escape in the cowardly sense Alfredo's kind would have named it. It had been the first honest act of self-respect she had made in a world that preferred obedient suffering over inconvenient truth. And deep under the wound where the bond had broken, something else had begun to stir. Not healing yet. Not quite. But the faintest suggestion that beyond survival, there might be transformation. Recovery did not feel noble. If Connie had once imagined healing as a clean upward line, rest, treatment, renewed strength, Restored confidence, Shadow Veil disabused her of that fantasy quickly. Healing was messy, repetitive, humiliating in quieter ways than public rejection. Some mornings she woke thinking the worst had passed, only for the bond flare to strike by noon and leave her sweating through her training tunic. Some nights her inner wolf stirred just enough to give her hope, then vanished so completely the next day that she wondered whether she had imagined it. But what changed in Shadow Veil was not the pain itself, it was the meaning surrounding the pain. In Thornwood, weakness was evidence. It proved you lacked what power required. In Shadow Veil, weakness was treated as information, a condition, a phase, a challenge to be studied, met, trained through, healed around. No one romanticized Connie's injury, but neither did they use it to define her limits permanently. That distinction altered everything. Gina West began her work with Connie on the 5th day after her arrival, once the healers decided her bond fever was stable enough for controlled movement. Gina was not gentle. She did not believe in the kind of encouragement that comes wrapped in softness. What she believed in, Connie learned immediately, was accuracy. "You compensate on your left side when the bond pain spikes," Gina said during their first session in the lower practice yard. Connie held a training staff with hands that still trembled slightly from the morning dose of silver bark. "Because the pain radiates through my right ribs." "Correct." Which means, in a real fight, you are unconsciously inviting someone to exploit your center line. Connie adjusted her stance. Too much. Connie adjusted back. Still wrong. What a reassuring teaching style. Gina's face did not move. "If you want reassurance, speak to a poet." That should have been irritating, but something in Connie almost welcomed it. Gina wasn't mocking her. She wasn't using failure to reduce her. She simply refused to flatter someone back into fragility. Every correction implied the same thing. Improvement was possible, and therefore expected. By the end of that first session, Connie could barely lift her arms. Gina looked entirely unimpressed. "Come back tomorrow," she said. Connie breathed through the ache. "That sounds suspiciously like you think I can." "I know you can," Gina replied. "The question is whether you'll keep showing up once your pride stops getting credit for survival." That hit deeper than either of them acknowledged. Because Gina was right. Crossing the mountains had still been partly fueled by shock and wounded dignity. But long-term rebuilding demanded something less dramatic and more difficult. Patience. The willingness to become bad at things, then less bad, then competent, without applause. The next day, Gina added footwork. The day after that, controlled sparring drills. Then, endurance training. Then breath discipline during pain cycles. Then resistance exercises designed not only to rebuild muscle, but to retrain Connie's body not to interpret every internal bond spasm as imminent collapse. "You're teaching me how not to fear my own body," Connie said one afternoon after a particularly brutal series of recovery drills. Gina folded her arms. "No, I'm teaching you how not to worship your fear of it." Connie sat on the training mat, hair damp with sweat, lungs burning. "Those sound uncomfortably similar." "They aren't. Fear is useful. Worship makes it a ruler." That too stayed with her. Jason Phillips entered her life the week after. If Gina taught the body how to become reliable again, Jason taught the mind how power actually moved beneath appearances. He was older than Ernesto by perhaps 10 years. Narrow-built, silver at the temples, with the kind of measured speech that made every sentence feel like part of a larger strategy already unfolding 3 steps ahead. At first, Connie assumed he had been assigned to assess the political danger of keeping a Thornwood exile in Shadow Veil. She wasn't wrong, but Jason had a broader purpose than surveillance. "You understand herbs, social currents, and emotional detail," he told her during their first formal conversation in the archives hall. "Those are forms of intelligence. Thornwood likely undervalued them because they cannot be displayed as dominance. That does not make them less strategic." Connie sat across from him at a long cedar table covered in territorial maps. "Is this where you tell me I've been secretly powerful all along?" Jason's mouth tilted faintly. "No. This is where I tell you that raw potential without structure is a romantic lie. If you want influence, you must understand systems." And then he began. Pack governance, trade routes, resource dependency, interpack diplomacy, how scarcity changes behavior, how insecurity in leaders produces theatrical displays of control, why some communities confuse fear with loyalty, how a Luna's influence differs from an Alpha's, and why the most effective Lunas often shape outcomes long before councils realize whose thinking they are using. Connie listened, at first exhausted, then fascinated. In Thornwood, leadership had always been presented as something almost biological: dominance, charisma, command. Alfredo had embodied that myth so completely that many never noticed the machinery around it. Jason dismantled those assumptions piece by piece. Authority, he said one afternoon, sliding carved tokens across the table to represent pack actors, is only stable when enough people believe it serves shared survival. The moment authority becomes too dependent on image, it grows brittle. Such leaders respond to challenge, not with adaptation, but with control. Alfredo, Connie said before she could stop herself. Jason looked at her over steepled fingers. You said the name, not I. He rejected me because I didn't fit his image of what a Luna should signal. Then he told you more about his weakness than yours. Connie stared at the map between them. I know that in theory now. Some days I still don't know it in my bones. That is normal, Jason said. The body often remains loyal to old hierarchies long after the mind detects the lie. That sentence explained half her life. Because Shadow Vale was teaching her something no one in Thornwood ever had. Environments shape self-belief. Not metaphorically, practically, repetitively. If you live inside a structure that rewards compliance and shames complexity, you begin to prune yourself in advance. You stop attempting growth in directions the structure cannot validate. You call that maturity. Sometimes you even call it loyalty. Connie began to wonder what parts of herself had been left undeveloped, simply because Thornwood never made room for them. The answer came from places no one expected. The first sign appeared during a healing circle. One of the valley children had taken a deep claw gash to the shoulder during a reckless stream crossing, and Connie was assisting the senior medics with stitching and silverleaf compression. She had done such work before. Nothing about it should have been remarkable. But when the child panicked mid-treatment and his partial shift began to destabilize, Connie reached instinctively for him, not physically first, but with presence. Voice low, hands steady, breath matching his. The moment her palm touched his fevered skin, a pulse of cold silver traveled through her arm. The child calmed instantly. So did the wound. Not healed, no magic nonsense like that. But the inflamed tissue around the tear visibly eased, as if the body itself had accepted some deeper instruction to stop fighting the treatment. The senior healer looked up sharply. What was that? Connie withdrew her hand. I don't know, but over the next week it happened again. And again. Once with a panic-struck apprentice caught in a failed shift. Once with a wolf suffering bond anxiety after the death of a sibling. Once, most startlingly, during one of Connie's own pain episodes, when a bright silver current rose under her skin and instead of tearing through her, moved outward in a clean wave that quieted the room into stillness. People noticed. Shadow Vale, however, noticed differently than Thornwood would have. No one turned it into gossip. No one decided instantly that Connie must be a chosen miracle. Ernesto ordered observation. Gina adjusted training intensity to see whether stress increased the phenomenon. Jason requested archive records on rare bloodline expressions. The healers tracked patterns with disciplined curiosity. Eventually, Jason invited Connie into the oldest records chamber below the council terrace. Dust floated in shafts of angled light. The air smelled of cedar, paper, and time. There are references, he said, opening a cloth-wrapped ledger older than anything Connie had ever touched, to a rare lineage expression sometimes called the white silver wolf. Connie read the faded ink slowly. Not a separate species. Not a mythic creature in the childish sense. A rare inner wolf manifestation associated with high emotional resonance, unusual stabilizing energy, resistance to coercive bonds, and in extraordinary cases the ability to strengthen communal calm during conflict or healing stress. She looked up. This sounds like legend trying to describe traits it doesn't understand. Most old history is exactly that, Jason said, but legends still preserve pattern. Connie's pulse quickened. You think this is me? Jason did not indulge dramatic certainty. I think several things. 1. Thornwood likely misread your nature because it values visible dominance over subtle force. 2. Your bond injury may have disrupted surface access to your wolf while triggering deeper latent expression. 3. If this is what we suspect, then Alfredo rejected not a weak mate but one of the rarest stabilizing power signatures seen in generations. Connie laughed once, softly, in disbelief. That would be almost funny. It will be, Jason said, once the consequences finish unfolding. Even then, Connie did not suddenly transform into certainty. Discovery does not erase conditioning overnight. She still woke some mornings hearing Alfredo's words in memory. Lacks presence, lacks command. She still entered council-adjacent spaces with residual caution. She still half-expected someone important to decide she was useful only as a temporary patient. But Shadow Veil kept contradicting those old reflexes with lived evidence. Gina pushed her harder each week and treated improvement as normal. Jason trusted her analytical observations during territory briefings. The healers began requesting her specifically for difficult, calming cases. Children who had once stared curiously at the Thornwood outsider now ran to greet her near the herb terraces. And Ernesto, most unsettling of all, watched her growth not with possessive fascination, but with a kind of measured respect that seemed to widen as her capabilities did. One evening, after a long session in the upper field, Connie and Ernesto stood overlooking the valley, while dusk moved slowly between the trees. Her muscles ached. Her braid had half fallen loose. The air smelled of wood smoke and early frost. You move differently now, Ernesto said. Connie glanced sideways. That sounds ominous. It isn't. The first week you trained like someone apologizing to the ground for taking up space. She exhaled a surprised laugh. Was it that obvious? To anyone paying attention. And now? Now, he said. You move like someone testing whether space can belong to her before anyone grants permission. That went through her like warmth and shame and hope all at once. I still don't know what I'm becoming here, she admitted. Ernesto rested his forearms on the railing. Good, she blinked. Good? Yes. Becoming is safer than performance. People who know exactly what role they want too early usually end up imitating power instead of developing character. Connie looked out across Shadowvale, the training circles below, the infirmary lights near the stream, the smaller lodges folded into the hillside. In Thornwood, everything felt like performance by the end. Even grief, even loyalty. That's what happens when leadership starts needing witnesses more than truth. She was quiet for a moment. Did you know that the first thing you said to me that night at the border changed something in me? Ernesto turned his head slightly. Which thing? You said courage isn't the thing I'm lacking. He considered that. It was true. I know. I know that now better than I did. But at the time, Connie swallowed. At the time, it felt like someone had interrupted a sentence Thornwood was trying to finish inside me. Ernesto looked at her then, fully, with that unsettlingly direct stillness of his. Connie, environments are always finishing sentences inside people. The question is whether the sentence makes them smaller or reveals them more accurately. She held his gaze a second too long, then looked away first. If Alfredo had represented one model of power, image-driven, acquisitive, allergic to ambiguity, Ernesto increasingly represented another. Not softness, not passivity. Shadowvale was clearly disciplined, strong, capable of force when necessary, but its strength did not depend on constant humiliation of weakness. Ernesto did not seem threatened by other people becoming more competent under his leadership. If anything, he expected it, built for it. That might have been the most radical thing Connie had ever seen. As winter edged closer, her body continued to change. Not all at once, never theatrically. But one dawn in the training ring, Gina ordered a full, controlled shift attempt under supervision. Connie closed her eyes, inhaled the sharp cold, and reached inward. For one terrible second, nothing answered. Then the silence split, not with the familiar muted silver of her old inner wolf, but with something brighter, cleaner, almost white where silver should have been. The force of it surged through her spine and limbs like ice catching light. She dropped to one knee, gasping not from pain, but from intensity. The air around her seemed to sharpen. Frost feathered briefly across the edge of the water trough nearby. When she opened her eyes, Gina had gone still in a way Connie had never seen. "What?" Connie asked, breathless. Gina's jaw tightened, not with fear but with astonished calculation. "Again," she said. The second attempt came easier. Later that evening, after multiple controlled observations and enough quiet alarm to confirm this was no misfire, Jason put the truth into words. "The white-silver wolf is not just a dormant trait," he said. "It's emerging." Connie sat in stunned silence. Emerging, not invented, not gifted from outside, not bestowed by a man, a title, a ceremony. Emerging. Something within her had not been absent all those years. It had been waiting beneath conditions that could never call it forth. That realization altered not only how she saw herself, but how she saw the entire architecture of her past. Thornwood had not failed to celebrate her because she was too little. Thornwood had been structurally incapable of perceiving the kind of power she carried because that kind of power did not flatter the values the pack worshipped. A leader like Alfredo would always misread someone like Connie, because he knew how to evaluate ornament, intimidation, and symbolic utility. He did not know how to evaluate stabilizing force, relational intelligence, or strength that made others stronger. In Shadowvale, Connie was learning not simply to recover from rejection, she was learning to recognize that the most dangerous lie she had ever believed was that being unchosen by one system meant she lacked value in all others. And somewhere beyond the valley, though she did not know it yet, Thornwood was beginning to feel the absence of the very person it had dismissed as replaceable. News reached Thornwood slowly at first, the way dangerous truths often do. Not in one clear report, but in fragments that could still be denied. A trader mentioning that Shadowvale's infirmaries had become unusually efficient during the early frost illnesses. A passing scout remarking that Ernesto Evans had increased mountain patrol security with a precision suggesting new advisory input. A healer from a neutral valley station, noting that a silver-scented woman from Thornwood had been seen assisting in multi-pack recovery cases and that wolves twice her size listened when she spoke. At first, Alfredo dismissed it. He had spent months convincing himself that Connie's departure was strategically irrelevant. Thornwood had adjusted, just as he knew it would. Brianna Sadlio had stepped into ceremonial spaces with smooth competence. Council attendance remained strong. Patrol numbers were unchanged. Officially, the pack had lost nothing of importance. That was the story Alfredo told others. It was also the story he repeated to himself. But leadership built heavily on image must constantly monitor what the image reflects back. And slowly, in ways even Alfredo could not fully control, the reflection began to shift. The first real problem came from morale, though no one named it that in council. Instead, they spoke of tension, inconsistency, declining cohesion in lower-ranking work circles. Small things, training disputes that escalated too fast, healing staff turnover, young wolves less eager to volunteer for ceremonial duties, none of it dramatic enough to call crisis, but enough to irritate Alfredo, who valued disciplined atmosphere almost as much as direct obedience. Then, winter provisioning stumbled, not because the supplies were missing, but because the coordination around medical reserves, food distribution, and family support had grown less intuitive since Connie left. Thornwood had never publicly acknowledged how often she moved through invisible labor webs who needed what, which households were nearing strain, which injured patrol wolves required check-ins before pride prevented them from asking. She had done it quietly, the way relational intelligence often works, stitching stability into gaps no one prestigious bothered to notice. Once she was gone, those gaps widened. Brianna tried to compensate with stricter oversight and formal channels. That pleased Alfredo initially. It looked organized, decisive. But what it produced in practice was compliance without trust. Wolves followed orders and stopped offering nuance. Problems arrived later and in worse condition. Healers became cautious about contradicting warriors. Apprentices learned to present polished reports rather than messy truth. Alfredo, who had once thought Connie lacked command, began ruling a pack that obeyed more and functioned less. Still, he might have sustained the illusion longer if Shadowvale had remained quiet. Instead, Shadowvale grew stronger in exactly the areas Thornwood subtly weakened. Their winter sickness rates dropped. Cross-border disputes decreased. Neutral traders increasingly preferred their routes because their negotiations became calmer and more predictable. Even the old Eastern clans, notoriously suspicious of outside influence, began sending difficult cases to Shadowvale's healers after hearing of unusual results with panic shifts and trauma stabilization. And in report after report, sometimes named, sometimes only implied, one figure kept surfacing: Connie. At first, Alfredo felt annoyance, then disbelief, then a harder, more private emotion he refused to call fear, because each story carried within it an accusation. Not that Connie had survived. Survival could be dismissed as luck or Ernesto's opportunism. The accusation was deeper. Connie was proving valuable in ways Thornwood had entirely failed to imagine. Worse, those ways were publicly visible now. The woman Alfredo had rejected as too quiet for power was helping stabilize another pack's influence across the region. That meant his judgment had not merely been unkind. It may have been catastrophically wrong. Brianna noticed the shift in him before anyone else did. She was too politically attuned not to. "They're exaggerating her role," she said one evening after a tense council session. "Shadowvale benefits from turning your discarded mate into a symbolic contrast. Ernesto is clever enough to use sentiment when it serves strategy." Alfredo stood by the long council window, hands clasped behind his back. Snow moved past the glass in pale sheets. "Do you believe that?" Brianna paused. "I believe perception matters as much as fact. That wasn't my question." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "No, I don't think the reports are entirely fabricated." Silence stretched. Brianna chose her next words carefully. "But that does not make your original decision unsound. One can become useful elsewhere and still be wrong for Thornwood." Alfredo wanted to believe that. It aligned neatly with the story he'd been telling himself for months. But something in him had begun resisting the simplicity of it. He remembered Connie in council observation sessions years earlier, saying almost nothing until she quietly pointed out a flaw no one else had considered. He remembered injured wolves calming when she entered the infirmary. He remembered younger pack members drifting toward her without seeming to know why. None of it had looked like power in the shape he respected. But perhaps that had been the problem. He respected only one shape. And now Shadowvale was turning another shape into visible strength. The thought festered. Alfredo did not miss Connie emotionally in the way romance songs describe longing. What he missed, though he would not have admitted it then, was the possibility that he had stood in front of something strategically rare and dismissed it because it did not flatter his instincts. For a man whose self-concept rested on superior judgment, that possibility was intolerable. So, he reframed it. Connie was his fated mate. The bond, though publicly severed, had not entirely gone silent on his end. At odd hours, he still felt flashes, a silver-cold pressure at the back of his sternum, a sharp pulse of awareness that had no source in Thornwood. If she had grown stronger elsewhere, if her inner wolf carried unusual lineage potential, if her presence now reinforced Ernesto's standing, then allowing that to continue could be interpreted not as dignity, but as strategic negligence. He began telling himself he was correcting an imbalance, not reclaiming a woman. Correcting an imbalance. That language made the next steps easier. Jason Phillips had predicted something like this long before Connie heard the first rumor from the Southern traders. "Men like Alfredo rarely regret publicly," he told her during a late archive discussion. "They reinterpret. If your growing influence cannot be denied, he will not say I was wrong. He will say circumstances changed." Connie had gone still over the ledger in front of her. "He'll come for me." "Yes. Because he wants me back?" Jason's expression remained mild. "No. Because your existence elsewhere is becoming evidence against his judgment." That proved true sooner than even Jason expected. The formal summons arrived at Shadowvale during the first hard freeze of early winter. It came through ceremonial channels, sealed with Thornwood markings, carried by two ranking envoys whose posture announced offense before either man spoke. Ernesto received them in the lower council hall, not the elevated ceremonial chamber. Another deliberate choice. Connie was not present initially, though every muscle in her body tightened when word reached the infirmary wing. Later, Jason would tell her exactly how it happened. The lead envoy bowed stiffly and delivered Alfredo's message in language so polished it almost concealed the underlying insult. Alpha Alfredo Foresight of Thornwood formally requests the return of Connie, daughter of Thornwood blood, whose displacement into Shadowvale territory has extended beyond hospitality and now interferes with unresolved bond rights, pack jurisdiction, and traditional claim authority. Ernesto let the words settle without rescuing them from their own ugliness. "And what," he asked at length, "is meant by unresolved bond rights?" The envoy did not falter. Though public rejection occurred, certain ancient interpretations hold that where a fated mate remains unclaimed by alternate formal bond, the original Alpha retains standing to contest her transfer, particularly where her current placement strengthens a rival pack. Jason, seated at Ernesto's right, later confessed he nearly laughed aloud at the audacity. Ernesto did not laugh. "Your Alpha rejected a partially awakened mate in public and damaged her health severely enough that crossing mountains alone seemed safer than remaining in his care. Shadowvale does not acknowledge ownership language over sentient wolves." The envoy's jaw tightened. "No ownership was implied. It was," Ernesto said calmly, "and badly." The second envoy stepped forward then, voice sharper. "Connie belongs by blood to Thornwood." Ernesto's answer came colder. "Blood is not chains, nor does birth erase choice." The exchange escalated from there, in the controlled, way dangerous negotiations do, each side remaining formally composed, while the real conflict sharpened beneath every sentence. Finally, the lead envoy delivered Alfredo's true escalation. If return is refused, Alpha Alfredo invokes the ancient trial of claim. That changed the room, not because anyone believed the trial morally justified, but because the old law, ugly as it was, still existed in the region's ancestral compacts, rarely used, deeply contested, yet not entirely obsolete. It had once been intended for disputed bonds, pack fractures, or contested allegiances in eras when border authority was unstable and female agency had been treated as secondary to lineage politics. Shadowvale considered the tradition barbaric. Thornwood now intended to weaponize it. When Connie learned this, fury hit her so cleanly it almost felt like relief. Not grief, not heartbreak. Fury. "He's not doing this because of destiny," she said in Ernesto's council chamber later that night. "He's doing it because I became inconvenient to the narrative." Ernesto stood across from her, broad hands resting on the table edge. Gina leaned against the far wall. Jason remained seated, fingertips together. No one contradicted her. "He rejected me in front of everyone," Connie went on, pacing now despite the silver tension already beginning to rise under her skin. "He said I lacked command. He said I wasn't fit to stand beside an Alpha. And now that Shadowvale can see my worth, now that he risks looking blind, suddenly old law matters?" "No," Jason said. "Now control matters." Connie stopped. "If I refuse? Morally?" Jason said. "You should be able to." Politically, refusal allows Thornwood to frame Shadowvale as having seduced away unstable bond property. Gina's mouth hardened at the last two words. Ernesto's eyes were on Connie, not Jason. "We can refuse and prepare for fallout. And prove nothing changes," Connie said bitterly. "A man names a claim, and everyone else rearranges themselves around its threat." Silence answered that because it was true enough to wound. Then Ernesto spoke. "There is another path." Connie looked at him. "We answer the challenge," he said, "but not on Thornwood's terms." Jason's gaze shifted. "Meaning?" "Meaning the trial occurs in neutral ground under witness from 3 packs and the eastern clans. Meaning no one speaks of her as property. Meaning Connie's right to self-declaration is established before combat ritual is acknowledged." Gina straightened from the wall. "That will enrage Alfredo." "Good," Ernesto said. Connie stared at him. "You would fight him." "Yes." Her pulse jumped. "Why?" His answer came without ceremony. "Because he is trying to dress possession as tradition and strategy as destiny. Because he wounded you once, when you had less power to resist, and he expects law to finish what humiliation began. Because if this stands, It teaches every pack in the region that a woman's value can be denied until it becomes useful to reclaim her. No one in Thornwood had ever spoken of her life in terms that large. Connie felt the room tilt, not from weakness this time, but from the enormity of being seen not merely as an injured individual, but as a precedent. Still, she forced the hard question. "And if you win?" Ernesto held her gaze. "Then you decide what happens next." That landed harder than any vow. "Not I keep you safe. Not I claim you properly. Then you decide." Something fierce moved in Connie's chest, silver, bright, and rising. The days leading to the trial changed her again. Shadow Veil prepared for combat, diplomacy, and fallout with equal seriousness. Gina intensified Connie's training, not because Connie would be the primary fighter in the formal challenge. Ancient law still centered alpha strength, but because Gina refused to let her stand in the center of political storm, feeling physically helpless. "You will not enter that ground carrying Thornwood's old posture in your body," Gina said, driving Connie through relentless sparring patterns. "No shrinking. No apologizing. If he looks at you and sees the girl from the moon circle, then your spine is telling an old lie." Jason worked with her on something equally important. Language. "What words will you use if asked whether Thornwood retains claim?" he said. "None," Connie answered. "I reject the premise." "Good." Again. "What words if Alfredo says he has returned to correct a mistake?" "He doesn't get to rename injury as correction." Again. "If he says the mate bond gives him, right? The bond is not consent. Fate is not ownership." Again. By the 10th repetition, those words had become more than arguments. They had become anchors. Meanwhile, the white-silver wolf continued emerging in controlled bursts. Under stress, Connie's scent shifted colder, clearer. Her presence during training sometimes altered the emotional field around her, lessening panic, sharpening focus. The healers observed it. Gina adapted around it. Jason quietly warned that if it manifested publicly during the trial, everything would escalate. "Because it proves Alfredo wrong?" Connie asked. "Because it proves his error was historic." The trial ground was chosen at Blackstone Hollow, a neutral ring of ancient standing stones used only for matters old enough to make every pack uncomfortable. Witnesses came from Thornwood, Shadow Veil, 2 smaller neutral packs, and 3 Eastern Clan representatives whose attendance guaranteed no side could later rewrite events entirely. Connie rode in with Shadow Veil at dawn. The cold bit through her cloak. Frost silvered the grass. Breath rose white from wolves and horses alike. She saw Thornwood across the hollow and felt her body react instantly. Old memories. Old pain. Old social reflexes preparing to make her smaller. Then Gina, beside her, said without looking over, "Shoulders back." Connie obeyed. When Alfredo stepped into the ring, the past and present collided with brutal force. He looked exactly as he always had. Composed, immaculate, carved from certainty. But now Connie could see what she had once mistaken for strength. The rigidity, the dependence on form. The way his authority seemed to sharpen only when reflected by witnesses. His gaze found her across the stones. For one suspended moment, everything in the world narrowed to that line between them. He had expected, perhaps, to see hurt, remnant longing, conflicted confusion. Instead, he found someone standing among those who had strengthened her. Clothed, not as his discarded mate, but as a woman who had survived his judgment and learned to interpret it properly. Something unreadable flickered across his face. Good, Connie thought. Let him feel uncertainty for once. The opening formalities were spoken. Ancient law cited, witnesses named, and then, before Ernesto or Alfredo entered combat declaration, Connie stepped forward. Every head turned. This was not standard, which was exactly why she had chosen the moment. Her voice carried clean in the frozen air. "Before any claim is spoken over my life, I will speak for myself." Murmurs rippled around the hollow. Alfredo's expression hardened. One of Thornwood's elders shifted uncomfortably. Ernesto remained still, but Connie could feel the force of his attention like steady heat at her back. "I was publicly rejected by Alpha Alfredo Foresight under sacred witness," Connie said. "I was judged unworthy, not as a person, but as an image. My health was damaged by that act. My standing was destroyed by the system that protected his choice. I left Thornwood because remaining there meant the continued collapse of body, spirit, and self. The words did not shake. Months ago, they would have. I stand here now not as property under dispute, not as territory under transfer, and not as a symbol for two male leaders to contest. I am the one whose life was affected. I am the one whose future is at stake. If any trial proceeds today, let every witness mark this clearly. No old law has authority to erase my right to choose where I stand. Silence followed. Not empty silence. Impacted silence. Alfredo's jaw had gone rigid. One Eastern clan elder gave the smallest approving nod, and Connie, feeling the white-silver current begin to rise beneath her skin, understood with absolute clarity that whatever happened next, the old script had already broken, because Alfredo had returned, expecting to manage a narrative. Instead, he had walked onto a field where Connie was about to expose every weakness hidden inside the model of leadership he once believed untouchable. Once Connie spoke, the hollow changed. No standing stone moved. No law vanished from the air. No pack elder tore up ancestral compacts in dramatic enlightenment. But the center of gravity shifted. What had been framed as a dispute between alphas now carried a visible fracture. Witnesses could no longer pretend this was an abstract matter of territory or bond custom. Connie had forced everyone present to confront the truth they preferred to keep hidden inside ceremonial language. A woman's life was being debated under tradition designed to minimize her agency. That made everything afterward more dangerous, because challenged power rarely retreats with grace. Alfredo stepped forward first, expression controlled but eyes colder than before. You are not summoned here to distort lawful tradition with personal grievance. Connie's pulse rose, but not with the old fear. She knew that tone now. It was the voice of authority attempting to shrink truth by calling it emotional. I was summoned, she said evenly, because your authority could not bear what I became beyond it. A sharp murmur passed through the gathered wolves. Alfredo's gaze hardened further. You speak with borrowed confidence. That might once have struck home. Now Connie saw it clearly for what it was. An attempt to make growth look illegitimate because it happened outside his control. No, she replied. I speak with recovered perspective. For one brief instant his mask cracked not dramatically, but enough. Enough for Connie to see that this truly was not about fate, regret, or even desire. It was about insult. Not the insult he dealt her months ago, but the insult her transformation now represented to his self-image. Alfredo had built leadership on the certainty that he could identify value instantly and arrange it appropriately. Connie, standing strong in neutral ground, witnessed by rivals and allies alike, threatened that certainty more deeply than any romantic rejection ever could. The old rites required that the claim be spoken clearly before combat commenced. Alfredo turned from Connie toward the witnessing circle and delivered the words in the formal language of ancestral challenge. I, Alfredo Foresight of Thornwood, invoke contested mate claim by blood, bond remnant, and disrupted lawful transfer. I challenge Shadow Veil's interference and seek restoration of rightful standing. Every syllable was precise. Every syllable was poison. He still spoke as if people could be restored to places they had been broken in. Then Ernesto entered the ring. He did not stride in the theatrical way some alphas might have. He simply stepped across the stone boundary with a calm that seemed to absorb the cold itself. Dark coat, no ornamental armor, no excess gesture. Connie had watched him in battle drills, in council, in patrol reviews, in infirmary halls where frightened children clung to his sleeve without fear of rebuke. She knew his strength now, not just the physical kind, though he had plenty of that. The rarer kind. The kind that did not need to make others look small in order to appear large. When he spoke, his voice carried without force. I, Ernesto Evans of Shadowvale, reject the premise that any pack holds ownership standing over Connie's future. I answer this challenge only to deny coercion the shelter of tradition. Let all witnesses mark that she stands by her own will, and that any outcome failing to honor that will is illegitimate, no matter what old words are spoken. That, more than Connie's own speech, visibly unsettled some of the older witnesses, because Ernesto had not merely defended her, he had attacked the foundation of the trial itself while still stepping into it. He was using the law's own public stage to expose its moral collapse. Jason, standing among Shadow Vale's witnesses, later said that was the moment Thornwood began losing, even before combat started. The terms were set. No killing blow, yield, or incapacitation ended the contest. Witness intervention only in case of unlawful escalation. Ancient, ugly, controlled, Connie stood at the ring's edge with Gina on one side and Jason just behind. Her hands were steady. That astonished her. Months ago, Alfredo's presence alone could have dragged her into emotional freefall. Now the fear still existed, but it no longer ruled the room inside her. Shadow Vale had trained too much truth into her body for that. The opening clash came fast. Alfredo moved first, sharp and efficient, all concentrated precision. He fought exactly as he led, dominating tempo early, forcing reaction, using polished aggression to define the field. Ernesto absorbed the first sequence rather than meeting it with equal display. He pivoted, redirected, drove Alfredo off-center, tested range. A different style entirely. Less about proving superiority in every exchange, more about reading structure, letting the other man reveal his habits. Connie saw it almost immediately. Alfredo fought to win the scene. Ernesto fought to understand the system of his opponent. Steel flashed. Boots tore frost from the ground. The hollow, filled with the raw physical language of old power violence ritualized enough to be called law, but still violence. Alfredo was strong. Connie had never doubted that. He had earned his rank in the ways Thornwood valued most. His strikes were disciplined, his reactions fast, his endurance excellent. More than once, Ernesto had to give ground under the force of him. The watching wolves tensed with each impact. Thornwood's side visibly brightened whenever Alfredo pressed advantage. But as the fight stretched past the first brutal minutes, the difference between the two men grew clearer. Alfredo's style hardened under resistance. When denied immediate control, he intensified. Ernesto adapted. Where Alfredo's anger sharpened into overcommitment, Ernesto's focus deepened into patience. Where Alfredo used strength to force the world back into the shape he expected, Ernesto kept adjusting to the shape that actually existed. And Connie, watching, realized the fight was showing the same truth their leadership did. One man needed control to feel powerful. The other trusted himself enough not to. That realization became almost unbearable when Alfredo landed a hard blow to Ernesto's shoulder and Thornwood's witnesses surged with approval. Connie's breath caught, not because she doubted Ernesto entirely, but because memory crashed into the present too many years of seeing Alfredo win rooms, win arguments, win obedience simply by escalating until no one wanted the cost of resisting him. Beside her, Gina said quietly, "Watch his breathing." Connie focused. Alfredo's chest was rising too fast. His offense remained dangerous, but not sustainable. He wanted the decisive submission. He wanted Ernesto down before the symbolic weight of the fight began slipping away from him. Because if he could not dominate clearly, then the trial would stop reinforcing his story. Then came the moment everything nearly turned catastrophic. Alfredo drove Ernesto back toward the north standing stone and, instead of maintaining lawful range, feinted high and struck low with enough force to risk permanent damage. Gasps broke from the witnesses. Ernesto twisted, taking the hit glancing rather than direct, but the move crossed a line close enough to expose intent. Shadow Vale wolves bristled instantly. Thornwood's elders looked away. Connie felt the white-silver current ignite under her skin like lightning poured through ice. Not because Ernesto was in danger alone, because the old pattern had revealed itself nakedly. When Alfredo could not control the outcome through legitimacy, he was willing to corrupt the rules themselves while still claiming the moral high ground. And something in Connie refused, with a force older than fear, to let that pattern govern one more moment. She stepped into the ring. The witnesses shouted at once. Gina cursed. Jason inhaled sharply. Ernesto turned, startled. Alfredo froze mid-motion, but Connie was no longer moving from panic. She was moving from decision. The cold silver force rising through her did not feel like borrowed power or wild magic. It felt like alignment. Like every lesson Shadow Veil had taught her about agency, systems, leadership, trust, suddenly converging with the deepest truth of her own emerging wolf. When she spoke, her voice carried through the entire hollow. Stop. No one should have listened. Under old law, this was not her moment. Not officially, not by ritual structure, and yet every body in that ring paused. Every witness felt it. The air itself seemed to sharpen. Frost spread in a thin white shimmer across the stones near Connie's feet. Her scent changed silver, cold, luminous, unlike ordinary wolf energy. Several Eastern clan representatives went utterly still. One Thornwood elder made a broken sound under his breath. The white-silver wolf had surfaced, not as a monstrous spectacle, as presence, as undeniable fact. Alfredo stared at her as if seeing, too late, the shape of the error he had made. Connie faced him fully. You do not get to reject me when I am inconvenient, and claim me when I become powerful, she said. You do not get to wound me, watch a pack isolate me, and then return under ancient law to rename that cruelty as right. You do not get to speak of destiny now that my value embarrasses your judgment. Alfredo recovered enough to say, You are letting Shadow Veil turn you against your blood. No, Connie said. Shadow Veil taught me to hear myself clearly enough to know when blood is being used to excuse control. The ring held its breath. She turned slightly then, not away from Alfredo, but toward all witnesses. Let every pack here understand this. A bond is not ownership. A woman's future is not an extension of alpha pride. And no tradition worthy of survival should require silence from the one whose life it claims to decide. The white-silver current pulsed outward as she spoke. Not violently, stabilizingly. Wolves on the edge of half-shift tension eased without knowing why. Fear in the witnesses thinned into focus. Even the air felt cleaner. Jason would later say it was the first time in years he had seen a crowd move from spectacle hunger into collective conscience. Alfredo, however, was unraveling, because everything that empowered Connie in that moment invalidated the system through which he had once dismissed her. Her presence was overwhelming not because it dominated, but because it harmonized. It did not bend others through intimidation. It clarified them. That kind of strength had no place in Alfredo's worldview. He could neither own it nor imitate it. His voice grew harsher. You are my fated mate. The old words. The old cage. Connie met them without flinching. You had a fated bond presented to you. You answered it with contempt. What exists now is consequence. And then, before anyone else could reclaim the scene, she did the one thing that truly ended the old script. She chose. Not in the passive sense. Not as prize handed to the winner of combat. Not as grateful survivor transferring dependence from one alpha to another. She turned toward Ernesto, who stood bruised, breathing hard, eyes fixed on her with something deeper than triumph. When I crossed the mountains, Connie said, I did not know whether I would survive. I arrived broken, doubting my own worth, carrying a judgment I had almost mistaken for truth. Shadow Veil did not save me by telling me I was special. It saved me by giving me structure, honesty, discipline, and room to become visible to myself again. Her gaze did not leave Ernesto's. You fought today, but more than that, you refused to speak of me as something to possess. You made space for my voice before your own victory. You understood that standing beside power means nothing if that power does not honor the person beside it. She stepped fully to his side. I choose Ernesto Evans. The words rang through Blackstone Hollow with the force of a door closing on an entire era. Not because she needed a man to complete the scene, because choosing freely, publicly, after surviving coercive judgment, was the clearest possible rejection of the structure Alfredo represented. The reaction spread in waves. Shadow Veil's witnesses exhaled like a held storm breaking. The Eastern clans bowed their heads in acknowledgement of a precedent they had just watched become history. Thornwood's side fractured into expressions Connie would remember for years. Shock, resentment, confusion, dawning shame. And Alfredo? He looked. For the first time since she had ever known him, smaller than the role he stood in. Not physically, spiritually. Like a man who had built an identity around being the one who chooses, only to discover that real power can survive not being chosen by him at all. The formal ruling came minutes later under witness consensus. Trial void in moral basis beyond contest. No continuing claim recognized. Connie's declaration of freestanding entered record. Thornwood's invocation criticized, though not fully condemned by all. Ancient law, while not abolished that day, emerged publicly wounded. But the legal outcome mattered less than what everyone had seen. A rejected woman had stepped into the center of old violence and refused to let any man define destiny on her behalf again. That was the true ending. Everything after would merely unfold from it. Victory, Connie learned, was quieter than revenge. There was no single day when the region woke and declared a new era had begun. No messenger crossed every border shouting that old law had cracked, that one alpha had fallen morally while another had prevailed, that a rejected mate had become the most respected Luna in the Eastern Territories. Real change never moves that neatly. It comes through decisions repeated until people realize the ground under their beliefs is no longer the same. Still, Blackstone Hollow had changed the balance. Thornwood returned home carrying more than the humiliation of a failed claim. It returned carrying witnesses. That mattered because Alfredo's style of leadership depended on controlling interpretation. He could manage dissent inside familiar walls. He could pressure elders, reward loyalists, rename cruelty as necessity. But once a man's weakness is seen in neutral ground by outsiders who owe him nothing, the story becomes harder to contain. He tried anyway. At the first Thornwood Council after the trial, Alfredo framed the outcome as procedural distortion, shadow veil manipulation, and emotional interference from a wounded former pack member. Brianna supported him, though less forcefully than before. Some of the older advisors nodded out of habit. Others remained silent too long. Silence, in packs like Thornwood, is where collapse often begins. Because wolves had seen him. They had seen Alfredo invoke old law not from love, not from spiritual conviction, but from threatened control. They had seen Connie speak with more composure under pressure than many alphas manage in victory. They had seen the white-silver presence rise around her like living proof that Thornwood's judgment had been catastrophically incomplete. They had seen Ernesto defend agency where Alfredo defended entitlement. And most dangerous of all, younger wolves had seen that hierarchy was not destiny. That idea spread faster than any official statement could stop. Within weeks, minor resistance surfaced in practical ways. A patrol captain challenged a needless punishment order. 2 healer apprentices requested transfer to joint winter study in Shadowvale, rather than remain under Brianna's increasingly rigid supervision. Trade families asked for more collaborative agreements instead of Thornwood's usual dominance clauses. None of these were rebellions on their own, but together they signaled erosion. The spell of unquestioned judgment was weakening. Alfredo responded as leaders of his type often do when trust declines, by tightening control, more inspections, more ceremonial assertion, more loyalty language, more visible punishment for indirect non-compliance. It worsened everything, because fear can produce order briefly, but it cannot reproduce belief once belief has cracked. By spring thaw, Thornwood's internal cohesion had thinned enough that Brianna Sadlio made the move no one expected from her. Ambitious as she was, she understood systems better than Alfredo did, and she knew a sinking hierarchy when she saw one. Rather than continue tethering her future to his decline, she opened quiet back-channel communication with Shadowvale regarding border stability, healer cooperation, and winter conflict prevention. Jason Phillips recognized the intelligence behind it immediately. Gina mistrusted it. Ernesto considered it useful but insufficient. Connie, when asked her opinion, said the truth. She isn't becoming noble. She's adapting. Jason had smiled faintly at that. Precisely. Adaptation is still preferable to collapse when peace is on the table. The resulting agreement, signed months later under cautious witness, became the first formal peace and cooperation framework between Thornwood and Shadowvale in 2 generations. It was not romantic. It did not erase damage. Alfredo signed only after political isolation made refusal costly, yet the document existed. Joint medical corridor access, seasonal trade moderation, emergency passage rights for wounded non-combatants, shared border de-escalation language. For Connie, That mattered more than symbolic apologies ever could have, because her story had never truly been about one cruel man. It had been about what kind of structure rises after people survive one. By then, her own role in Shadowvale had grown beyond anything Thornwood could once have imagined. No one had simply placed a title on her head and called the transformation complete. Ernesto insisted on the opposite. Position without architecture fails, he told her when some council members first suggested immediate formal Luna designation after the trial. We do this well or not at all, so they built it. Connie entered regional planning sessions not as ornament, but as strategist. Jason guided her through trade and council frameworks until she could spot pressure points before older negotiators finished their opening statements. Gina expanded her field authority in training and resilience programs, arguing correctly that a Luna who understood bodily recovery and combat psychology could bridge warrior and healer cultures better than tradition usually allowed. The Valley Healers brought Connie into long-term system design, particularly for trauma response, post-bond stabilization, and young wolf emotional regulation. This last area became one of her greatest contributions, because Connie understood, intimately, what it meant for a body to carry the verdicts of a damaging environment. She knew how shame lived in posture, appetite, breathing, silence. She knew how authority could make a person mistrust their own instincts. And she knew, from Shadowvale's example, that care becomes powerful only when embedded in structure. So she proposed something no pack in the region had ever formalized, an interpack healer exchange and trauma study program. At first, some elders dismissed it as overly idealistic. Others saw it as political softness. But Connie built the case with relentless precision. Packs were losing young wolves to unmanaged bond injuries, panic shift accidents, and post-conflict trauma. Healers were trapped inside local customs that limited learning. Mutual training would reduce mortality, improve diplomacy, and lower the long-term cost of avoidable instability. In other words, healing was not separate from power. It was one of its strongest foundations. Ernesto backed the proposal, but importantly, he did not speak over her. He strengthened the political frame and let Connie lead the argument. That mattered in every room. By the time the first exchange cohort was approved, even skeptical neutral packs admitted she had changed the terms of regional influence. She was no longer merely the rejected mate who rose. She was becoming something much harder to dismiss, a builder of systems people could feel working. The white-silver wolf, meanwhile, continued to mature. It never made Connie invincible. That was not its nature. If anything, its gifts required more responsibility than brute force ever would have. In tense negotiations, her presence could settle emotional escalation. In infirmaries, severely distressed wolves responded to her stabilizing field more quickly than to normal intervention alone. During a spring flood crisis, when 3 mountain families arrived in shock and partial shift after losing a crossing bridge, Connie's centered calm helped prevent a mass panic that could have turned fatal. Word spread, not as myth this time. As reputation. Children trusted her. Healers sought her. Warriors respected her because she understood fear without glamorizing it. Even visiting alphas, some older and deeply reluctant, learned to stop underestimating the woman who could enter a room and make conflict, reveal its true shape without ever needing to dominate it theatrically. Months later, under full witness and with a ceremony Shadowvale designed carefully to avoid the ugliness of possession, Connie formally became Luna. Not because Ernesto chose her, though he did, and with a depth she no longer doubted. Not because fate repaired what Alfredo broke. It did not. The old bond remained what she had named it. Consequence. And not because power finally dressed her in a role she had once been denied. She became Luna because she had already been doing the work. That difference changed the meaning of the title itself. On the morning of the ceremony, Gina tightened the fastening on Connie's silver-clasped dark cloak and muttered, "If anyone cries too loudly, I'm leaving." Connie laughed. "You say that every time a ceremony happens, and every time I mean it." Jason arrived with final council records, dry as ever. 3 Eastern delegates are early. 2 neutral packs brought gifts. Thornwood's representation is limited but present. Connie paused. "Alfredo?" Jason shook his head. No. Brianna. That felt right somehow. Alfredo's absence no longer registered as wound, only as proof of the distance between old and new structures. When Connie stepped into the valley ring, sunlight touched the standing water near the herb terraces and broke into silver shards. Shadow Veil had not covered the ground in petals or elevated her on display stone. Instead, the ceremony took place at the convergence point between the council path, the training field, and the healer gardens. Deliberate, symbolic, a Luna, in Shadow Veil's model, stood at the meeting point of governance, strength, and care. Ernesto took his place beside her. Not ahead, beside. The vows they exchanged were not vows of ownership, obedience, or completed destiny. They were vows of witness, trust, counsel, and mutual responsibility to the people whose lives their decisions would shape. When it was Connie's turn to speak, she looked not only at Ernesto, but at the assembled valley, the healers, the trainees, the children, the visitors from beyond the borders, and even Brianna standing unreadable among Thornwood's small delegation. I was once told, Connie said, voice clear in the morning air, that I was unfit to stand beside power because I did not look like the version of strength others expected. I believed that for too long, not because it was true, but because I lived in a place where truth was filtered through pride. The valley held silence with her. I know now that leadership is not the ability to inspire fear, nor the talent of appearing invulnerable. Leadership is the discipline to build trust strong enough that others do not have to shrink for you to stand tall. It is the courage to listen before you command. It is the willingness to create structures where healing matters as much as victory. And it is the humility to understand that the people beside you are not symbols for your rule. They are minds, hearts, and strengths you are responsible for honoring. Somewhere to her left, a child began crying softly, not from distress, but because ceremonies make the honest cry more readily than the cynical. Connie smiled faintly and continued, If my life carries any lesson worth keeping, it is this. Rejection is not always proof that you are unworthy. Sometimes it is the doorway out of a system too narrow to recognize what you carry. Sometimes leaving is not loss. Sometimes it is the first act of loyalty to the self that truth requires. This time, even Gina did not pretend not to be moved. When the vows concluded and the witnesses marked the union, it felt less like a crowning than a confirmation of something already lived into existence. In the years that followed, Connie became, by quiet consensus rather than propaganda, one of the most respected Lunas in the region. The healer exchange expanded. Border violence declined. Young wolves from multiple packs trained under programs that integrated physical resilience with emotional recovery. The phrase white silver gradually stopped sounding like myth and began sounding like a leadership style, one that stabilized rather than dominated. Thornwood never fully collapsed, but it changed under pressure. Alfredo's authority thinned, then narrowed, then became increasingly ceremonial while real adaptive governance moved around him. Brianna, practical as ever, positioned herself near the future rather than the ruins. Some in Thornwood still resented Connie. Others, especially the young, began speaking her name with a complicated mixture of shame and admiration. A few even crossed quietly into Shadow Veil training routes seeking models their own pack had failed to provide. Connie did not gloat. That surprised some people, most of all. But she had long since understood something Alfredo never did. Power built on humiliation remains haunted by the need to relive its victories. Power built on trust has better things to do. Sometimes, on cold nights when the valley slept and moonlight silvered the eastern slopes she once crossed half-broken and alone, Connie would stand outside the healer hall and remember the girl who left Thornwood before dawn believing she had been judged out of her future. She wanted, sometimes, to reach back through time and tell that version of herself everything, that the pain would not be the end, that the body could relearn trust, that one Alpha's inability to see her clearly did not define the limits of her worth, that she would one day build systems where others like her could survive faster, heal sooner, and doubt themselves less. That love, when it finally stood beside her rightly, would not ask her to shrink into a symbol. But perhaps the younger Connie had not needed all the details. Perhaps it would have been enough to tell her one thing. You are not leaving because you failed. You are leaving because the room that named you too small was never large enough for what you were becoming. And in the end, that was Connie's true victory. Not that Alfredo lost her, not even that Ernesto won her, but that she built a life, a title, a bond, and a legacy on foundations so different from the old world that the very meaning of power changed wherever she stood.